President Theodore Roosevelt seemed indestructible, but an ill-fated expedition into the Amazon jungle nearly cost him everything. Born in 1958 in New York City, Theodore Roosevelt was the son of a wealthy, long-established New York family. We're talking back when old New York was once New Amsterdam. Yet, as he grew older, it became all too clear that the boy had fragile health. Young Theodore was undernourished and beset by frequent fevers and respiratory issues. Most infamously, he suffered from intense asthma attacks that left him terrified and struggling for breath. Generally speaking, being outside could trigger more asthma attacks, but for Theodore, the trips to the outdoors to get fresh air really sparked a love for wild spaces and the sciences. And while confined to bed, Roosevelt was able to engage his mind, becoming a bookworm who consumed tales of heroic masculine figures such as Ivanhoe and Robin Hood. As Roosevelt aged, his asthma seemed to fade into the background. Roosevelt himself said that his dedication to regular exercise was a key to his improved health. Modern science today backs it up, so he was way ahead of the curve there. Yet he continued to deal with occasional asthma attacks as an adult during periods of intense stress. Roosevelt began studying at Harvard in 1876, where he met Alice Hathaway Lee. The two married on October 27, 1880. By 1882, at the age of just 24 years old, he was serving as a New York state legislator, and by 1883, the two were expecting their first child, while planning an idyllic summer home on Oyster Bay, Long Island. He seemed to have everything. Alice gave birth to a daughter, also named Alice, on February 12, 1884. Teddy was away in the state capital of Albany, but on February 13th, a telegram carried the news that his wife's health was deteriorating rapidly. He rushed home and arrived the next day. That's Valentine's Day if you're following along. There he discovered a double horror. His beloved mother Martha had died earlier that day of typhoid fever in the same house in which, mere hours later, his wife Alice too died of an inflammation of the kidneys. Teddy shortly took to his diary, but only wrote that the light has gone out of my life, and marked the page with a black X. A later entry recounted the union between Teddy and Alice, with Roosevelt writing, "We spent 3 years of happiness, greater and more unalloyed than I have ever known fall to the lot of others." After the deaths of his wife and mother, Roosevelt left for property he owned in the Dakota Territory. Mostly he was just getting away from everything. Pain, the politics, all of it. Though he found time to write 3 books as well, and when he finally returned to his political ambitions, his time in the West gave him a new manly image that boosted his career.
And now he could say he was a cowboy.
But it came at a cost. Roosevelt destroyed letters that mentioned his deceased wife Alice and refused to speak of her for the rest of his life. His young daughter Alice grew to have a complicated relationship with her energetic and famous father. When he remarried to Edith Kermit Caro in 1886, Alice found herself competing for attention with Teddy's growing new family, a likely motivation for her hell-raising behavior and oftentimes sarcastic personality. After his second marriage, Roosevelt seemed to find new vigor for life, basically returning to the East full-time and becoming the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He left that office to serve as a lieutenant colonel in the Spanish-American War, and gained a masculine heroic image for leading the Rough Riders Cavalry Regiment in the Battle of San Juan Hill. As a Republican, he then proceeded to win the election for governor of New York in 1898. In 1901, he ascended even further up the political ladder, becoming vice president as part of William McKinley's administration. Yet, Roosevelt was hardly excited about the job. When McKinley was elected, he grumbled to a reporter saying, "This election tonight means my political death." He was pushed into the infamously powerless role by New York Republicans who had found the boisterous, reformed-minded man troublesome. You see, McKinley's vice president, Garrett Hobart, died in office. So when McKinley needed a new VP on his re-election ticket, the power brokers decided they'd just bury Roosevelt in that meaningless position and be done with him. Yet party chairman Mark Hanna was still nervous, reportedly exclaiming, "Don't any of you realize there's only one life between that madman and the presidency?" Mere months into the administration, Hanna was proven all too right. In September, an assassin shot McKinley while the president was attending the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. McKinley's abdominal wound became infected, and he died on September 14th. Roosevelt suddenly became the nation's youngest ever president at age 42. Roosevelt's subsequent term was successful enough that he won the 1904 election on his own.
He was able to make a name for himself, make an impression, and accomplish a great deal wherever he landed.
Theodore Roosevelt's life was marked with periods of deep depression as well as periods of boundless energy and activity. A 2006 study published in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease suggested that Roosevelt may have had bipolar disorder. However, the medical world's understanding of mental health is very different now than it was during Roosevelt's life, so this is still speculation, as obviously no diagnosis was made while he was alive. Still, a history of the Roosevelt family includes quite a few cases of apparent mental health struggles. Theodore's brother Elliot dealt with substance abuse and may have taken his own life. Theodore's son Kermit was highly accomplished and productive, yet also experienced depression and alcoholism alcohol abuse and took his own life in Alaska in 1943. Daughter Alice may have exhibited manic symptoms of bipolar disorder, while her daughter Paulina experienced depression and also died by her own hand, just like her uncle. There's also Quentin, who was a lot like his father Theodore. We'll get to him in a bit, just keep watching. By 1912, Roosevelt had already served almost 2 full terms as president and had garnered a reputation as a progressive modernizer and U.S. expansionist. In 1906, while still president, he had even been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for shepherding a diplomatic end to the Russo-Japanese War. He was supposed to be enjoying the post-presidency life afforded to past presidents. But then there was the problem of William Howard Taft. Once a protege of Roosevelt, Taft had been elected president once and was running for another term as a Republican in the 1912 election. Yet he ran on a platform that Roosevelt had deemed overly conservative. Theodore sought to put the country more in the direction he wanted, so he challenged Taft for the nomination, and chaos ensued. Theodore actually won the majority of the primary votes, but Taft and his backers actually controlled the convention. So you know what that means. Taft got the nomination. An incensed Roosevelt ran as a third-party candidate for the Progressive Party, popularly known as the Bull Moose Party. The rift between the two men, which split the Republican Party, was only truly ended by Roosevelt's death. On the evening of October 14, 1912, during the fraud election campaign against Taft and Democrat Woodrow Wilson, an assassin named John Schrank shot Roosevelt with a revolver. However, the bullet first struck Roosevelt's overcoat pocket, which contained a lengthy speech and his metal eyeglasses case. This slowed the projectile enough that, while it still entered Roosevelt's body, it did not kill him. He went ahead with his speech, because of course he did, dramatically telling the audience that he had just been shot and that the bullet was still inside him. He only went to the hospital once the speech concluded, 15 minutes later. That's 50. Though he played it off to his wife Edith as a mere flesh wound, the projectile had stopped just short of striking major organs. Doctors decided to leave it lodged next to a rib, perhaps remembering how an infected bullet wound had killed President McKinley. But though the incident boosted support for Roosevelt, it wasn't enough. With the Republican vote fractured between Taft and Roosevelt, Wilson won and became the next U.S. president.
Roosevelt, with 27% of the popular vote, polled a higher percentage than any third-party candidate in history has done.
While the 1912 assassination attempt on his life had some obvious repercussions for Roosevelt, it also had a less obvious effect on his arthritis. Reportedly, the intensity of his injuries and the presence of that bullet exacerbated pre-existing arthritis, making his joints all the more uncomfortable for Roosevelt in the remaining years left to him. Speaking to today's Wound Clinic in 2018, Susan Sarna, the chief of cultural resources at Sagamore Hill National Historic Site, said that arthritis was an increasingly difficult problem for the president as he aged, causing painfully swollen joints that contributed to issues he had with walking. These may or may not have been familial, as his older sister Anna dealt with serious attacks of arthritis throughout her adult life. With the 1912 presidential election loss to Woodrow Wilson, Roosevelt found himself hanging around New York at loose ends. Then he received a fateful letter inviting him to go on a speaking tour throughout South America. This appealed to the adventurous Roosevelt, who one-upped the plan by tacking on a specimen collection expedition on the Amazon River, bringing in a couple of naturalists from the American Museum of Natural History. Once there, he upped the ante again and decided that it was just the right time to attempt to map the Amazon tributary known rather ominously as the River of Doubt. Good thing Roosevelt's young adult son Kermit was already in Brazil and volunteered to join the group, in part because Roosevelt's wife Edith was worried that her aging husband was going to really overdo it this time. Edith was right. Things started off well enough, with Roosevelt showcasing his classic energy and enthusiasm, but illness, insects, accidents, rushing waters, insects, and supply issues plagued the dwindling group. And insects, if I didn't mention that. As the weeks wore on, Roosevelt eventually grew seriously ill and endured an infected leg wound, exacerbated by insects. At one point, he even demanded that Kermit leave him behind to perish.
There was something in Roosevelt's character that required him to take on challenges, however risky they might seem.
Kermit refused, and eventually Theodore rallied, finished the trip, and returned to New York in May 1914. Yet the trip took a serious toll on his health, and Roosevelt finally retired from the adventuring life, later blaming some of his ongoing medical issues on his Brazilian misadventure. The youngest of Theodore's children was born on November 19, 1897. Quentin appeared to have inherited his father's extroverted charm and considerable energy. Following in the footsteps of his father and other members of the family, Quentin also began attending Harvard in 1915, but the educational path changed for him when the U.S. entered World War I in April 1917. Quentin quit college and joined the U.S. Army Air Service to become a combat pilot in Europe. There, he was shot down in the skies over France on July 14, 1918. 4 days later, Quentin's death was reported, though his family didn't get official word until July 20th. For Theodore, who had been a vocal advocate for the U.S. joining the war and encouraged his own sons to join up, this was an especially painful blow. Writing to the French Prime Minister in July 1918, he claimed that, "It is very bitter to me that I was not allowed to face the danger with my sons." He wrote to others that he was proud of his son's bravery and sacrifice, but admitted to daughter-in-law Belle Willard Roosevelt in August 1918, "It is no use pretending that Quentin's death is not very terrible. As for Mother, her heart will ache for Quentin until she dies." Though Roosevelt was clearly aging, it still came as a shock to the nation that the man famed across the globe for his energy and vitality had died suddenly in his sleep. He was just 60 years old. His obituary, published in the New York Times right after his January 1919 passing, reported that his death shocked not only the nation, but Roosevelt's own doctors, who concluded that he'd been felled by a pulmonary embolism. The grim details of his death included the fact that he had suffered from inflammatory rheumatism, and in case you're wondering, that's brought on by arthritis. Though they had been political opponents, President Wilson officially announced Roosevelt's death the next day. He directed that all U.S. flags be flown at half-staff in Roosevelt's honor, writing, "In his death, the United States has lost one of its most distinguished and patriotic citizens, who had endeared himself to the people by his strenuous devotion to their interests and to the public interests of his country."